we're gonna make this thing happen. Let's do it. So last time we linked, we started doing like a little quick start into the React ecosystem. We've talked a little bit about some of the main concepts with regards to utilizing React, but nothing's better than seeing some practical code and whatnot to show us how all of these things come together. And that's exactly what we're building here. So right now we're building What's Up. What's Up is like, it's like my version of WhatsApp, but built on React. And the whole idea is just an application that eventually will get to the point where folks could kind of leave a message and we see a list of messages. And that is basically what we're going to build. But we're just kind of doing it in a way that allows us to talk through some of the other React concepts as we do that, right? So not like a crazy official WhatsApp clone of any kind, but just talking about the core concepts of React while building out something more practical so y'all have something to put your eyes to. Maybe at one point we do turn this into like a little WhatsApp clone and whatnot, but that'd be a little bit beyond kind of the scope of what we're doing today. Either way, where we're at so far, you can see this really beautifully text-driven UI is centered here. And we got to the point where, based on the concepts of React that we've learned so far, we're able to get to the point where a user can click either of these buttons and render a new component, essentially, right? So we have it right now where it's either you click a button and you see kind of just this login text, or you click that button and you see kind of sign up, right? Again, like I told us last session, there's multiple ways to achieve kind of this feature of like, hey, one button links to another part of a React application. But the way we went about doing it was utilizing a new concept that we haven't talked about too much called state. And state is essentially a tool of React that allows for us to maintain some data on like the different state of our application at different points in time, right? So much like some folks asked a little bit after our last session, there's the reason that this is working how it's working is because we're considering our application having three states right now, right? The state of the user just click login, the state that the user just click sign up, and then the state that they haven't clicked anything at all, right? So in the state where the user hasn't clicked anything, it's kind of like right now, right? Right, what we're looking at right now on the page is the state where the user hasn't really clicked anything, and we're just waiting for them to click something. So that's state number one, right? State number two is the state of after a user clicks login, right? So after a user clicks login, that's when this login component gets rendered, right? State number three is, okay, you haven't pressed anything yet. Oh, well, you haven't pressed login. Oh, but you press sign up, right? And that's a completely different state of the application. It shows a different flow, for lack of better words, than either of the two previous states. If that kind of makes sense in terms of just breaking it down like those three states, give me a thumbs up just so I understand that y'all kind of get that point. And then we'll talk more about how we actually use the state in React to make that possible and what the code is actually doing for us to do that. All right, cool, dope. So yeah, I think it's best to think about state like a means of achieving this kind of programmatic logic in our application, right? There's moments when I want X, so I want to do X. There's moments when I want Y, so I want to do Y. State would be kind of like the variable that we use to maintain that knowledge of what part of those flows are we in right now. So if we take a look at our application, we could do a little walkthrough of the whole thing so far. Everything, like I told y'all, starts from the app.js, right? So whenever you look at a React project, particularly one that got started with the Create React App toolchain, the app.js is the most important component to look at first, right? So in this component, we get a glimpse at how our whole application is working. Right now, we have in the app.js, right? We have this function. Remember, this function is the main component. Oops, scroll too far. This function is the main component, right? So the entire component is what is returned from this function. So the app is our first component, and this function handles showing us the visual elements that eventually get rendered into our program in the HTML. What this component is rendering, you can always see, like a good way to, I'll just show you how I would look at these files is take a look at what the component is returning, right? So clearly this component is returning a div with a class called app, but inside that div, it's calling some JavaScript, right? And it's saying, hey, I want you to render whatever is returned by this function. So we're calling a separate function to render something for us, okay? So naturally, we might want to learn and take a look at what that function is doing. That function is up here called render page. So again, to just kind of zoom out, what our app is doing so far is, well, let me close this so we don't get confused here. So our app function, right, is everything from line 17 to line 50. This function is returning some JSX, right? And JSX is just a JavaScript markup language that allows for us to use JavaScript to render the visual elements on our screen. But like we talked about, one of the valuable things about building applications in React versus doing it in traditional HTML is that you can use those visual elements like you would in HTML, but you can also interweave them with JavaScript, right? So whereas in HTML, we would have had to only use HTML-like elements in a statement like this, in React, we can use part of those elements, those visual elements, like a div, for instance, but we can also start putting some JavaScript in the middle of those elements as well, both in the middle physically, like in between this div, we're actually putting some JavaScript to be the elements, but also in the middle of, meaning more like we can also pass data to these elements as well, and components and things of that nature, which we'll see in a second. So render page is a function. It's a JavaScript function. That JavaScript function is written here. So we created a separate function, and that separate function is responsible for rendering the page as it relates to utilizing that understanding of the different states that we were just talking about to say, hey, based on the state of the application, I will render a different component at a different period of time. So in the case where the state is starts off where a user clicks button or clicks login, a user clicks button, yeah, they click the button called login, right? We want to return the login. So you see a nice little if statement here. So if the button clicked was login, right, we're going to return login, right? The cool thing about JavaScript, despite the fact that it is a little bit more cumbersome with the way that the data is stored in JavaScript. So the fact that you don't have any strongly typed data can make it so while you're writing the code, you might feel confused. But hey, when we look back at some of what we've written, it kind of makes a lot of sense just reading it, right? So if button clicked, don't really know what that kind of data is, but hey, if a button was clicked, right, and it's equal to login, like, so clearly this must be a string. If it's equal to login, then we want to return the login component, right? Else, if the button that was clicked is equal to sign up, right, that's when we'll return the sign up page. Otherwise, we're going to return some code here that just is some JSX, and this JSX is essentially what we see here, right? The nice little heading with a couple of smaller text with some buttons, right? And all of that was defined here. So here's the heading, here's the paragraph, here's the button for the first one for login, here's another paragraph, here's the last button. And all of those buttons then handle some of the work of just knowing when they get clicked and whatnot, right? So I'm just looking real quick because I see now, I think I might have deleted something. Made the, never mind, just kidding. So the render page function, right, renders either of those JSX components to as a return, right? It returns one of three things. It either returns login, it returns sign up, or it's going to return this kind of smaller bit of JSX, which theoretically, right, all of this could be in its own component, but for some reasons related to time, we didn't actually put that in its own component. So there's three things that this function can return, but either way, hopefully you see that at one point, right, one of those three things is going to be returned in this statement here on line 49, right? So how does then the state part of all of this work? Well, we use a concept in React called state to create that logical flow of, hey, I want to keep track of the data at different points where it might change, right? State is always linked to data inside of a component that the component needs to know about that might be changing at different points in time, right? So the app component, right, is responsible for keeping track of what state of the application are we in right now. Are we in the state where button clicked was equal to sign up? Are we in the state where button clicked was equal to login? Are we in the state where button clicked hasn't been set at all and is equal to null, right? The way that the state declaration is set up, it achieves three things for us. The first thing is it gives us a variable that we can set at different points within our application using this function that is created at the side of it, right? The third thing it does is it defaults the value of this variable to whatever we put in parentheses, right? So state always kind of has a similar syntactic flow to it. It looks kind of funky with this destructured array here, but essentially, this is the way that we create a state object that we can then call the variable and call the function for. So I'll just show you another example. Let's say in a different application, I want to keep track of there's a form for an email, right? And the user is going to sign up and give us their email or something, right? Well, I might have some state to keep track of that user email, right? So I might have a variable called, user email or something, right? And typically we name the second variable here, the function, something that is related to whatever the first thing is, but with the word set in front of it. So we would say, so if this variable is called user email, we typically have something called like set user email, right? Then, right, we would do the use state function, and that function, we would say, what would be the default value of this value here, right? So you could say, hey, maybe it's an empty string. Maybe we don't have the email yet. We know it's going to be a string. Maybe we use an empty string, right? If we say null, we're just saying, hey, there's not even an object there. There's not even data there yet, right? It's null. There's no data whatsoever, right? Empty string, null, or we could even default it to some to a value itself, right? And so the idea of state is, now that we kind of written this syntax out, well, anywhere in our application, in our function now, in our component, we can make use of this user email as data, right? So I could theoretically use this as, I could reference this as data in different parts of the application using kind of like we already know, like the JavaScript syntax to add data to inside of our different components, right? So that would be me using user email, et cetera. Clearly, I don't have a form set up, but I can use that data I can use this data in unique ways, right? And have it inside of the application. And at different points, right, when it makes sense, maybe I do use the function to set the data itself, right? So state always has to have those three parts: the data that we're going to use as a variable, right? So in our case, in our app, it's button clicked is just a variable that we're going to have keep track of some stuff. The function that is going to be responsible for changing that variable. So in the programming space, we call this a setter, right? So this would be a setter method that sets the data that is stored inside of here, right? So we have the value and we can get the value. We have a function that allows us to set the value, and we have a default value to start with, right? So in our case, button clicked is the value, set button clicked would be the function. And we started it at null, such that we did this so that we could make use of it here in our render page function, where if button clicked, right, is using the data that we had in the state. So if the state of the app and button clicked as the value there is equal to the string login, right, then we're going to return the login component. Else, if the state, right, button clicked is different, we're going to call sign up. Else, otherwise, right, if it's not login or if it's not sign up, in our case, we know that it's probably null, right? And so if it's null, or if it's just either if it's null or if it's just not one of these two things, then we're just going to return the default component that shows what we want it to show to get somebody to click one of those two buttons. And last thing I'll say is, right, like you might be wondering, well, okay, well, where does this whole button click login thing get set, right? Well, that's what happens deeper into our application in the last part that we hadn't talked about yet, which is my button, right? We created a button component just so we could have a conversation about how components are reusable. So we use this my button twice. And in making this button reusable, we wanted to make sure that we could keep track of when that button was being clicked. And so separate from state, which is data that a component knows about itself and what's going on inside of itself, is another format of dealing with data and components, which is called props, right? And props are data that we want to pass from one component to another component. So whenever you want to pass the data from one component to another, you use props. But whenever you want a component to keep track of some data itself that might be changing based on things going on inside of the component, that's when you use state. A good rule of thumb is props can't be changed, state can be changed, right? So here, setting button clicked as data, we can change this using this method at any point in time. With a prop, right, if I pass a component props like we passed it in on button click or text here to the button, those data points can't be changed by the component at all, right? So now when we go to my button, it can only make use of the data there, right? So props.text clearly was passed in to the component as props. But what we did to make this button reusable was, hey, whenever you use my button, you could just specify what the text is, and it will make a button with that text. We also passed in and talked about how with props, you're not only, sure, you can pass in strings and data, simple data types that you might be used to, integers, numbers, whatever, Booleans. But beyond that, we can also pass in functions in JavaScript. And this is an example of us passing down a function as props. So we have a prop called onButtonClick. That prop is given some data that is actually a different function called notifyClickStatus. And notifyClickStatus is now able to be called whenever the child calls this prop onButtonClick. So going back to the my button, right? We see that the button, when it calls its own kind of onClick method, its own handle click method, what that function is responsible for doing is handling the click when it gets clicked, but also calling that function from props that we had before. Props.onButtonClick is really calling this prop notifyClickStatus. And so this is and will always be a very interesting part of the React design pattern, is passing functions as props so that you can create kind of this two-way notification system of essentially telling a child component. So anything that is being rendered in another component would be the child component. So all of this component here, this component are all children of the app, because the app is the one that's responsible for rendering them, right? So if the app wants to talk to any of these components, the only way it can do that is by passing down props, right? So that's one way relationship, right? The app saying, hey, I want to talk to the button. I want to tell the button what the text it should show is, right? That relationship is one way, and it says it's created that way through props, right? Again, props are how we send data from one component to another. But we can create a two-way relationship by passing in a function as props. And by passing in a function as props, we get to define what happens when this function gets called by the child. So essentially, notify click status is a callback function. It's a function that the child element is responsible for calling. And when it does, right, we can say, hey, when you call this function, I'm expecting you to pass in some text. That's exactly what's going on in the my button component here, where when it finally calls that prop, it's passing in the text that it had in and of itself. And that's where we're getting back the text that we use to call that method to set the state. So this design pattern is really important to just be familiar, just to start familiarizing yourselves with sending data to a child in the form of a function that then the child will call. The child will call this function. And if we want the child to send us some information, we just specify it as an argument in the function so that the child can pass that data into the function, and we can use it in whatever way we want, which in this case is how we ended up setting the state to be something different. This is how our app is working as we see it right now. So button clicked, again, is a state variable. It's defaulted to null when the app first loads. We have, though, this function to set it at some point. Button clicked is what we use to determine what thing should we render at any point in time, right? So right now, button clicked is null. So we're telling this application says, hey, button clicked isn't set. So we're in the state where button clicked is not equal to, we're in a state where button click does not equal login, or it does not equal sign up. So all we're going to do is show this. We're going to return this as the JSX that we want to see. Once the user actually clicks one of these, right, then the app re-renders, right, and essentially the app essentially rebuilds itself because now the state of the application is different, right? So button clicked is now set to something else, because as soon as the user clicks login, right? Login is attached to this prop called notify click status. This prop called on button click, which calls our function notify click status. So at one point that button, right, login, when the user clicks it, this component says, hey, I just noticed that you clicked me. I'm going to call this function that I need to call when something gets clicked. That function, handle click, is just a helper function that allows us right now to call on button clicked, which from props. And you might be wondering, well, why do you have so many functions? We could scale this down to take away some of the functions, but I just feel like that would make some of the what's going on a little bit more confusing. Like essentially, we could just say from on click here to just call props.on button click instead of having this kind of intermediate function. But I broke it out just so that folks can kind of see, hey, the button has an event handle function called handle click. So whenever a click is registered, it's going to call this function that's here. And this function is responsible for calling back our original function, which is the props on button clicked, that is essentially going to send us back to here, where when it gets called, it passes in the text, and that text is what we eventually use to set the state of our application. So we do this all for the sake of keeping the application adaptable and to use the same components over and over, right? So my button, we can still use this component no matter where we want to in any other part of the app. All it will do, this component is just essentially saying, hey, whenever this component is essentially saying, tell me what you want the button to say, right? And then tell me what you want me to call when the button gets clicked. So give me the callback function to call from props when the button gets clicked. And when it does, when we get clicked, I'll let you know which button I am by sending you the text. So you can say, oh, okay, it was this button versus this button, right? This is just how we achieve kind of modularity in these components, like Michael said in the chat, right? Is keeping things a little bit more open for change, but structured at its base, right? And this is our app as it kind of currently stands, right? So a lot going on here, but the biggest things to kind of keep in mind is we have components still, right? Each component, like the app, is responsible for rendering some JSX. What is new here is instead of just rendering the straight up JSX like we did originally, we ended up turning this into a function. So you can see now, hey, it's possible to render a function as a JSX, right? So long as this function returns some JSX or a component, then we're good, right? We know that it can be used as a return statement for our main component. Another thing that's new here is probably kind of like this conditional logic for rendering a component where we're saying, hey, if something, render this, else render that. This is called conditional rendering, where you use conditional statements or Boolean logic to determine what's your component going to do. And then lastly, well, I'd say second to last, right, is clearly we're using the state values to keep track of some data that's going to be changed by the component at some point, right? Anytime notify click status gets called, this button clicked value is being changed. And when this button click value is changed, the way that React works is whenever you use state, anytime this value gets changed, the component is going to re-render, meaning it's going to recall whatever the return statement is in our function. And because the return statement of our function is another function that checks the state, this is how the app is smart enough to say, okay, based on what this new state is, what component should I show? Thus giving us back this ability to see one component based on whatever button we click. So I'm gonna pause real quick and just would love, just give me a show of thumbs. If what you're seeing so far is making sense, I appreciate it. I appreciate seeing that. If you have a question, it'd be cool if you drop it in the chat for me, because I do want to kind of keep pushing forward a little bit. But I want to address any questions y'all have. So either drop a comment in the chat for your boy, or yeah, just let's talk about it toward the end. Cool. Seeing a lot of thumbs, appreciate that. So Michael, I see your question. I'm gonna get at that in a second. What do we mean by child function? Cool. That's a good question. So I'm going to talk about that as we kind of keep pushing forward. So essentially, right? So all of the components that we are rendering still follow everything we talked about on the DOM, right? So if you remember when we first talked about what JavaScript does for us, we talked about how JavaScript accesses the HTML DOM, right? So the DOM is a tree-like structure, where at the root is like the HTML element, and then there's all those other elements inside of the HTML element, etc., right? This is a very similar thing in the React space, except the DOM in React is focused on the components that are getting rendered, right? So the root component, right, would be the app component. That is the parent component of most of all the components we build. Whatever components get rendered in the app, right, like our sign up or our login, right, are different components that are child components of the parent component, which is the app. So we can see this structure a lot better, I think, when we look at the inspector, because the inspector kind of shows us the components that we render as the actual HTML, right? So inside of this div called with the ID root, we clearly see that the first component is the app, right? Class app. This is one reason why it's helpful to still add class name attributes to your components so that you have the opportunity to see those classes when you look at the elements in the inspector. So this div with the class app, right? It is the parent component because it is the one that's responsible for rendering and holding all this other components here, which if you look closely, this is a div h1 paragraph button, right? This is exactly what we rendered here, right? So this big block of JSX, like I said, we can consider this its own component. It's its own group of JSX that could be rendered. The difference is we didn't structure it to be its own file anywhere, right? It's just its own, it's just a block of code. But for like login and sign up, right? These are other components that we can clearly see because we tied them to their own files, right? They're being rendered in that component syntax. If you take a look at what happens, right? So right now, the way that the app is structured, we see that welcome kind of data, right? The H1, the paragraph, et cetera, right? If I go back to here, right, and I click login, just take a look here at the bottom in the inspector, what happens to the elements underneath the div with the class name app, right? So I click login, and as you can see, all those other elements just kind of got taken away from the DOM and replaced with this div called login, right? But the div class app is still there, right? That's because the way React works is the div with the class name app is our app component. Remember, this is what we're returning. So the parent component is still the same, but what's changing are these components that are underneath or stored within this component, right? Those components, right? The login component, the sign up component, or this block component here, we can think of as children to the app because they are rendered within the bigger overarching component that is the app component. So any component that is rendered inside of another one is considered the child of the one that it's rendered inside. So that's what I mean by what is a child component versus what is a parent component. Cool. So let's keep pushing. Let's keep pushing up and get to a point where we can see some more of this in a practical context as it relates to building out a little bit more functionality into our application as it stands. So if you're cool with that, we're moving a little bit forward, just kind of pushing forward on the app. Just give me a thumbs up. Just want to kind of take a pulse check where folks are at right quick. Cool. Seeing some thumbs, which is great. All right, cool. So let's just keep pushing and build out a little bit more robust nature for these different components here so that we can kind of see what's going on and continue to talk about the React stuff as we do it. So right now we have the ability to kind of log in, and we have the ability to sign up. But as you can see, like we kind of get stuck whenever we get to one of these components. So it might be helpful to have the ability to go back. That would be kind of helpful. But also, clearly, we do want to see some stuff here once you are in the application versus when you are signing up. So a couple different tasks. Like I said before, I love to give myself like a strategic plan while I'm hacking to just keep myself kind of accountable for what I want to do. One good place to do this, right, to just talk about your plan, talk about what you're doing, is in your README, right? So the Create React App toolchain gives you a defaulted README with just some information about how to run your project and whatnot. You don't have to use this, especially if you are keeping track of your project with Git. You can always go back to look at what this says if you are using Git. But you can always delete it and just use it for yourself as notes that accompany your application, right? So I'm gonna just call this what's up. READMEs use a specific syntax called Markdown. Markdown is its own kind of has its own syntax for like how to style text. So if you want to like learn how to style the READMEs and kind of some of the things like what do all these pound signs, hashtags mean, right? Learning more Markdown would be helpful, right? So these just kind of create different sized headings, right? So because this is the top, actually, let me just do something like this. But that's neither here nor there. The point of this README for me right now is just to kind of give me my little strategic plan. So I'll just do something like this and just say strategic plan. And we can just use this as a place to come back to for what we're trying to accomplish. So first thing, clearly, I want to be able to turn the sign up component to turn the sign up component into something that really allows us showing something that's showing us our messages, right? So just get to the point of our WhatsApp clone, right? The second thing I want to be able to do is turn the, oops, my bad, missed this. So this would be the login component, right? So once you log in, we would want to be able to see kind of like the messages, right? But we would want to turn the sign up component into something that is something that, you know, simulating the sign up process, right? Like maybe like a little form or something. And then clearly I want to kind of create some more like kind of ability to go back to the main component, right? To our main app. Because right now, the way it's working, I get to log in, I'm kind of stuck, right? Unless I really refresh the page or something, which is not really the best kind of syntax, right? Or it's not just the best for the component altogether. So these are kind of three things I want to achieve, and in doing this, we'll be able to talk through some more work with relationship to the React stuff. I think that what I'd like to do first is just get to the point and get into our logging component, right? So we can start talking about some more of the things we talked about last with props and sending data and stuff down. So let's start there with the logging component. So I'm gonna go back to the app real quick, just kind of clean up some of the stuff in here that I was using to talk to y'all, but just that I don't really need. Save that. And so clearly, right, if the button clicked is login, we're going to return the login component. The login component is right now just rendering some text. If we look at the login component itself, right, that would make sense because this function is only returning some text right now. So what I want to do is start building this component out to be a little bit more robust, right? Essentially, what I'd like for this component to do, I'll just leave a comment up here, is to render a component that is the main list of messages, right? So you logged in, but once it logs in, I want it to show kind of like the main app, the main like dashboard, for lack of better words. So what I'm actually going to do, I like that idea of a dashboard, right? I'm going to just create a new component. So in my components folder that I created, I'm just going to make a new component. I'm going to call it dashboard.js. And dashboard.js is just going to be a component responsible for rendering that bit of that work, right? So first thing I want to do is just create a function. So I'm gonna just do arrow syntax right now because I feel like it, and just go ahead and create a new component. I want to export it so I can call it in that other file, right? And again, all components just need a return statement to be a full component. So I'm just gonna render a little div right quick for myself to just make sure that this is working. And this div, I'm gonna put an H1 and say, this is my dashboard. And then I'm gonna put a nice little paragraph and say, here are our messages, right? So nice looking component. If you're rocking with me up to this point, just give me a thumbs up, right? We just kind of created a new component following the stuff we know about React so far. Should be kind of pretty straightforward here, right? So cool, got this new component called dashboard. And like I said, when we log in, I want the user to be able to see the dashboard component. So what I want to do is import dashboard from, and then I want to grab that dashboard from this folder. So because I created a folder and put all the components in the same folder, the import statement is very simple. It says, hey, look inside of this folder and grab the dashboard.js file that's inside of it. Now that I have that, right, in this return login function, I can make this a little bit more robust. And basically, instead of just returning this div that just says login, right, I can return a div, sure, but I can also have that div render the dashboard. So cool. So now I have this nice little component rendering here, right? And dashboard has its own code. So when we go back, right, login will be replaced with all of that code that we just wrote to talk about the dashboard. So computers reloading. Taking a sweet time to reload, but you know, like you know the vibes. That's crazy. Maybe it finally realized that at one point. What's crazy is I started the app and I started code and I was like, oh, I don't know where the server is actually running from, right? I didn't have it in VS Code. It was not running in my terminal, but it was just up. And I was like, oh, okay, well, we just go rock with it. And maybe React finally got hip to the fact that, hey, there's no server actually running. So I'm gonna just close this. Let's actually see if I go back to it and close it back up. That would be weird, but you know, I think it finally had that existential crisis, or it said, I'm not even running. What are we doing? So just remember, whenever you have a React project and you're working on and you want to start seeing this stuff happen, you need to have your server running somewhere. So you have to go to the project folder that the Create React App toolchain created for you. In my case, it was called My First React App. And then you want to just run npm start. So inside of here, if everything is good, right, this should just run and just say, hey, we good, we grooving. It's running on the same local host. If not, it'll tell us, hey, something's running on that port. So you might see this happen for y'all, right, where maybe something else is running on your port 3000, which is the default port for React. And because of that, right, it is going to suggest, hey, would you like to run the app on a different port? Instead, you just type Y, and what it's going to do is launch the app running on a different port. It should be running on like 3001 or something, right? So I'm going to just start that. Maybe that's going to help us real quick, get that back up there. By the way, if it takes too long to do that, what I will do is keep hacking, because I know where we're at and we can talk through it as we're building, and then wait till the server's up and keep it going. So I'll let this go. It looks like it's compiling now. Okay, now it's doing this thing. Okay, that's cool. Go ahead, React, take your time. All right, bet. So yeah, probably just a little server issue here. So I'll just close this. Anyway, we click login and now we see that this is our dashboard. Here are our messages. Clearly there's no messages, but we'll get there. So the login component is now rendering this dashboard component that we created, which is cool, right? So whenever you're building your apps, you can create as many components as you want. It just really depends on like what's the flow of the data, as well as what's the visual stuff you want to show on the application, right? So now, given this whole full flow and formatting, once they click login, cool, they're seeing a dashboard and some messages, which is actually kind of Makes more sense, right? Clearly, we would want to like collect some information to make it so that you could log in, but there, we'll get there. We'll get there one day at a time, one step at a time, right? So this is our component. This is our dashboard. Here are our messages. Bet. So here is where I would expect that we would want to show the user a list of messages, right? And the way we might do that, right? We might just kind of create a little div, and inside of the div is like, message one, and then, message two, right? Right. But this is not very scalable, because clearly I'd have to write every single message into the div for this to work, right? And I don't want to have to do that. I want to be able to show as whatever messages are there, right? And beyond this, right, just rendering this text like this, right? If I just say, like, let's just say message one, right? Just rendering this text is fine, except for the fact that, okay, well, what if I want to style this and give this some more context? Like, what if, like, each message had a similar kind of flow, and I wanted to kind of show in this like list-like format, right? So I'd need a div with the message, each one, right? And so as you can see, I'm also going to start repeating a lot of code here. Like, not only would I have to write as many messages as I want, I'd have to repeat a whole lot of code over and over and over again. So in those moments where you're like repeating something over and over, and you're looking like, hey, this actually isn't gonna support like a scalable solution, this is a great place to say, maybe this should be its own component, right? Clearly, like, a message might have specific formatting. It might have things like an author attached to it, the text that the person wrote, etc. And again, we might style it in some unique way. Because of that, it would make more sense, instead of me just kind of copying and just creating more and more and more and more and more messages, right? It would make more sense probably for me to structure this as its own component, like a message component, right? Give me a thumbs up if you see what I'm saying here, right? It would make a lot more sense maybe to structure that message as its own component, so that I can customize that message component, and now every other message, whenever I want it, can get changed, right? So that is one of the values of like using components in React, right? And a couple of days ago, or a couple sessions ago, we actually created a little message component. I'll just kind of just show y'all what it looked like so far, right? It's a super simple function. The component is expecting us to pass in some props with the content and the author, right? Of the particular content of the message. So I might use this component to just kind of be our message component. So to just kind of, let's just take a look at what that would do for our app. So inside of the dashboard, I'm just going to import message from /message. And here where we have message one, instead of this div, I'm just going to return a message, right? So this div is returning a single message. Right now, that message is empty, right? So I didn't give it any props. So we don't actually see anything but this kind of written by. So the reason why is because this message component, like I said, is expecting for props.content to be there and props.author to be there. So if I go to this message and I say content equals hello world, right? And I say, oops. And I say author is equal Cam, right? Now I kind of got like a nice message popping up, right? So clearly, right, like now with the message component, if I want to change something, like let's say like, hey, like I want this message to to maybe show this content like a little bit more, if I want to change anything about this, like the styling or something, right? I can, or, maybe instead of, the message being like just content and author, right? Maybe I add a profile picture or whatever else, right? I would be able to change that here, right? In one place, so that when I create another message, hey, now I have one place that is where I change anything related to a message. So this is cool. We have this nice little div kind of thing showing up with our first message, right? If we want, we can add another one to kind of just demonstrate the point. So just add another message here. Say, oh, cool message, and I say content equals this is cool. And I'm just be talking to myself for now, you know what I'm saying? This is my WhatsApp clone, right? So I'll just keep talking to myself, have a couple of different messages pop up there, maybe do one more just to kind of prove the point. Yeah, it's dope. And clearly what I'm doing here is passing the data as JavaScript. And you might be wondering, okay, well, Cam, you said that with JavaScript, right, we should be wrapping these in curly braces. That's true, right? But essentially a string is treated the same way as an object in JavaScript. That's like a tricky thing for most folks when you're first learning. It's like the data here is technically still an object, but I do personally like wrapping my stuff in curly braces so that it feels consistent to the rest of where I use the JavaScript in my React code too. So I do like kind of wrapping my data, even though with the string I don't necessarily have to. I like kind of just keep things consistent. So cool. Now I got 3 messages. They're all popping up into this nice little setup right here. That's real dope for me. I'm really proud of myself for making this nice little situation. If I refresh the app though, you know, still kind of have this functional kind of, hey, you know, based on what the state of the app is, when you log in, cool, you see all your messages, that's great. Otherwise, right, you got to sign up for an account, right? Okay. Well, now that we kind of have this dashboard in a decent place, I think it might be cool for us to focus on the sign up process, right? So the sign up process, right, is kind of also just was kind of defaulted to this little div, but this will be a cool opportunity to talk about another bit of data related stuff with React and talk about kind of forms, right, which is a really important kind of HTML interaction that takes place. So my plan for this component, right, is, my plan for this component is I want to turn this into a default like sign up form, right? Where the user, where, you know, we should collect an email and you know, we should collect the email, maybe a name, right, etc., right? And you know, the form could get as complicated as a password, whatever. The idea though is right now we don't have any of that. So let's go ahead and try to turn this sign up component into a form and use that form to make the app a little bit more robust, right? So what I'm gonna do, because I'm gonna be working with multiple components, I'm just gonna have to put these parentheses to wrap up those multiple components. You can keep a return like this when you have kind of a single line return. Like, so if you have anything returning in the same line, you don't need the parentheses. But because I already know that this is gonna take multiple lines, I'm gonna just wrap it with parentheses, so we have that there. And then cool, right? So let's just go ahead and take a look at HTML form real quick so that you all understand what we're talking about as we continue to build this all out, right? So forms are a very important user interface and experience on the web, right? Give it a thumbs up. Y'all seen something similar to this on the web before, right? You know what I'm talking about, right? Everywhere you go, no matter what app it is, you have a form as part of the login process, sign up process, like everywhere. And even in some places you might not expect, we use the form element in order to create that interaction. The form element, sorry, I had to grab some water. The form element is a pretty important element to know about in HTML because, like I said, it's ubiquitous. We use forms everywhere. Payment, collecting information, submitting text or submitting data to an application, right? A form is a good element to know when it comes to creating a user interaction that allows for you to get data from the user. So this is what a typical form looks like, right? And typically it kind of has things like labels and some input boxes and a submit button where you can submit the form and something should happen, right? The form in HTML is made up of the HTML form element, which is used to create a form with different elements inside of it. The form elements can have different things like text fields, checkboxes, radio buttons, submit buttons, all types of stuff. And if you want more details on all the possible form elements, you could use the W3 Schools or any other developer docs to just take a look at some of those elements. The main element of the form, most commonly used element, is the input element, which every form element contains inputs that allow for you to define what input are you going to collect from the user, right? Are we collecting text? Are we going to collect like radio buttons, right? There's also some stuff for like passwords as an input type. All types of things are here, right? And with an input type text, we can achieve much of what we hope to achieve with relationship to the what we hope to achieve with relationship to the what we have in our application right now, right? So when a user signs up, what I want to do is create a form, right? And this is also a great time to talk about different container elements. So remember, with React, it doesn't allow for us, if we have multiple JSX elements, like let's say I have 2 divs in here. Right, let's say I just have 2 divs. It's not gonna work either way, but you know, I have 2 divs here. So technically I'm returning 2 things. Well, React doesn't like it when you return 2 things that aren't enclosed by some wrapping element. And again, I told y'all, hey, typically when you see this or you get this error, you know, you want to wrap something in a div maybe, right? Because divs are great wrapping container elements. And that's true, right? Another alternative element for wrapping elements in React would be kind of just like a, wow, I'm completely blanking. What we call this draw right now. That's crazy. But fragment, there you go. Thanks, Fred. I appreciate that. Yeah. So we can call this, you could also wrap this in a fragment, right? Which is basically like a React element that isn't tied to an HTML element, but it's just meant to wrap your JSX, right? Divs, fragments, these are both great elements for wrapping different elements within a component. But one more that is really great to know that you can do and use is the form element, right? So the form HTML element also is considered a wrapping element that you can use to render multiple elements under the form. So the form element is dope when you know, oh, this is about to be a form, right? And you know it's going to be a form if you're about to have inputs and text and maybe even a button for the user. Sometimes you don't even need the button, but if you know you're going to have text inputs, wrapping your elements in a form is actually a great idea, right? So here in this sign up component, I want to show a nice little sign up form for the user. Clearly, we're using the HTML form element like we talked about here, within the W3 Schools, and we're going to end up building something very similar to this, right? First, what I'm going to do is just kind of, matter of fact, let's just add this and see what happens. Let's add the old HTML and see, because most of the HTML will convert over to our React. So let's see. So let me go ahead. rid of these break tags for me real fast. And I'm just gonna close these off. I think that's what was, I think that might have been what was throwing us off. Okay. All right, cool. So yeah, I think something was off with the closing tag. So in React, right, every element has to have like a closing tag in order to show up correctly. So right now we have the form element. We use the label, right? The label just kind of allows you to put a nice little label on top of your inputs, right? So here with the label, you can define the kind of connecting the label to whichever kind of inputs they are tied to. So this is an example of, hey, we have a label for first name and input for first name, last name, etc. I'm gonna just save this and let's see if it renders without any errors and shows us what we want to see. I get a couple warnings. I'll talk and maybe address those in a second. But here we got that nice little form showing up, right? So first name, last name. I might want to have another label, right, for the email. So just call it email, put a label, and just say email, and then close the label. Whoops. Oops, my bad. Right, so get the email and then again, put another input in here, type text. And it's nice to give these in HTML, right? We give most of our elements IDs when we want to refer to them. You can do the same in React, although it's not common that you're going to be doing like document object methods directly on the input, and we'll see why in a second, right? Because we can use the React connection to these elements to do a little bit more sophisticated things. But I will give it these attributes for now, and because they will come in handy when we're trying to determine the data from these different parts of the form. So cool, I have like the name, first name, last name, email, and of course, if I want to do some work to just kind of style these a bit better, right? I could do that by connecting the sign up to some CSS, right? And just kind of, let's say I did want to do some work here. And we haven't really touched on this, but if I did want to kind of start styling this and giving maybe the form some properties to make it such that it showed things in a different way, right? All I would want to do is create some CSS, corresponding CSS to be tied to this form. So maybe I give this form a class name and I say sign up or something. And then no matter where I want to put it, I could put the CSS anywhere where it will be reached via a parent or by that component itself. So the app.css, because it's being imported at the root of our application, theoretically inside of the app.css, I could add some more CSS that corresponds to the sign up, to the sign up component itself. So maybe we get to that toward the end if we have some time. But for right now, right, I got a nice little form. I can put some stuff in here, and that is really all I want. The only other thing that I'm kind of missing right now is a submit button. With forms, you can put things in a submit button. The submit button is a type of button that essentially calls the form to say, hey, I'm handling now, I'm taking care of some item, I'm gonna do some action, right? The submit button is a specific type of input in React or in HTML, right? It's an input of type submit that creates a button for you. So if I, let's say here, just kind of down, I say type submit, right? And just give it, say value equals submit. or just so this shows it better. Let's go, right? So type submit input creates a submit button, right, for the form, right? So this button is responsible for telling the form, hey, now that we have all this information, let's submit the form, right? And this is cool. This is technically like a nice little form. Of course, like, you know, some of the styling I might want to change, like I said, to make it so that when we are seeing this, maybe it's vertical instead of horizontal like this. That might be a challenge for y'all. But for right now, I think it's cool, good enough, right? So what just happened, right? I clicked this let's go button, and as you saw, the page kind of reloaded and went to a different route, right? Well, when you click a submit button on a form, right, the submit button executes a form's action. A form has a particular event that gets triggered whenever a user presses submit. That event is called, that event basically is just the action that the form takes. And the action that the form takes is always going to be triggered by the submit. And if we take a look at the form element, right, and we look at the HTML form, or let's just see, whoops. So there's a couple of different things that a form can do. Typically, we use forms to process that data and then send it to a database or send it to a server or anything like this. And those are all possible things. These are all possible options here whenever the form gets sent, right? But also within the React space, we can handle forms in some other ways. And one thing that's real cool, just to keep on y'all's radar, is that a lot of this information is in the React documentation. So if you go to the React docs, they have a nice section on a lot of the concepts we're talking about, actually. So this is my time to do a shameless plug of the React docs, right? Inside of the main concepts, clearly we've talked about a lot so far. We talked about JSX, we've talked about rendering elements, we've talked about components and props, and we talked a little bit about state. Now, you know, a lot of what we're getting into with the buttons, with forms, is about events. Conditional rendering, we touched on a little bit with how our app is working so far. Listing keys is something that I do want to touch on, but right now we're talking about forms, right? And forms in React have their own kind of, have some other unique things about them that are important to know as well. So here you can see clearly a nice little form with similar kind of format to what we have. But as you can see, unlike HTML, it's also a little bit easier to create the format we want with our forms as well, right? So instead of having to use all of these different attributes, we could just theoretically create a more wrapping kind of element here with this input inside of the label. So I think they had it kind of like this, right? Right, so that's cool. Save us a little bit of code. So I'm gonna do that. Just kind of follow what they're doing. So just change this last name. Give this a different thing here. And then last one is this email. And boom, cool. And we still got the submit button. So save this. That's dope. I like seeing that. That's actually really cool. So clearly this still is kind of loading the same way, but nice. I feel like it's a little easier to read now with kind of what's going on. But let's just keep going through the React docs on the form. Clearly, like I said, we can have an input with the type submit that will be used to submit our form. React forms are interesting in that how we use forms rely on data being changed within the component, right? So whenever we want to change some data inside of this form, right, we got to have some way of keeping track of the data as it's being changed and kind of rendering the components in a different way each time the form is being changed. For that reason, we typically will use state inside of forms. So forms are another place where state comes up quite a bit when we're working with our code. And so as you can see here, they're talking about how these types of elements, inputs, text areas, select elements, right, will be kept in the component using the state, right? And so how this works, right, is in the format of a form, right, is that we will typically create state to use in the process of creating our form. So one thing to note, because I haven't talked about it yet, but is important to note, is there's two ways of creating a component in React. One way is to create it, the old way, let's say, the old way was to create it with a class-based syntax. So in these old React docs, you'll actually see them doing it with the class syntax. But if you went to like the newer docs, I'm sure that they have another example of forms, but using functional components like the ones that we've been using too. I just don't know where they are in this docs right now. So, you know what I'm saying? We'll just do an example of our own. So basically, forms are responsible for maintaining some state. And actually, we can use this to talk through kind of what's going on in this class-based component. Whenever the form, right, whenever a label or input is being changed, right, we're going to want to make sure that we're taking care of that change and maybe setting the value of that input to something in state that we can reference later. So what that would look like for us is like this. So we have this sign up form, right? And we have the first name, we have the last name, and we have the email, right? And clearly in our application as it currently stands, right, you can already start typing into this. But where is this data being stored, right? Like if I were to click this button, where would I get a value of this data? So this is exactly where the idea of using state comes up, right? Because the fact is that these inputs are keeping track of what you typed. They're not storing the data anywhere for you to now call somewhere else. So in order for you to get back that data, we need to actually use the state in a creative way. So again, to just kind of go back to how we use state in the newer way, right? Whenever you want to use state and you're creating your code with like functional components like this, or with like the function keyword, you want to first import use state from React, right? So the syntax to import this is just like this: import open curly brace use state from React. And this is just because use state is a function that's inside of the React library. Now we can create a set of state objects that will be listening for the changes that are going on inside of these different parts of our form, right? So again, how the state object works, we create a nice little kind of destructured array with a variable that represents some data that we want to see here. So clearly the variable for this first name input might be first name. So I might have kind of a first name variable, right? I want to be able to set that variable. So I'm going to create a secondary variable called set first name that is responsible for being kind of the method that gets called when I want to change this data. Then I set it equal to use state, which is a function, and pass in what the default state will be. So before I had it set to null, right? I had in one of the other examples, I had set to null. In this case, because I know the label is gonna have a string, I could set this equal to an empty string like this, right? Either approach kind of works for what we're doing right now. Similarly, right? So this would allow me now to basically have a first name and a function to change the name whenever I want to change it, right? Similarly, right, I have two other variables in the state that I care about. I have last name, right? So I might want to set the last name. Similarly, I could start it as an empty string. And then I also have this email, right? So I have email, and maybe something like set email, right? And again, this is all text, so it makes maybe sense for this to start as an empty string, right? So how will I use this state in the form, and where does it come up? Well, again, right, what we want to keep track of is the data that a user is writing inside of this form, inside of these inputs, right? So as these inputs are changing, it would be great if we could keep a track of what the data is that the user is writing and then use it later whenever we submit the form finally, right? So we could totally do that with what we know so far about state and React, right? So every component, like, you know, despite the fact that they are tied to that HTML, you know, ancestors, the ancestors of HTML, all these components also have events that React can call as they're being interacted with. So one very helpful, thing to know about forms, inputs, right, is that there's a couple attributes on them that we can keep a record of and use to our advantage in working with them. So for instance, one particular value, or one particular attribute of like inputs, which are the text part of things we're typing in, right, is the value attribute, which we use to specify, you know, the initial values of those things. I wonder if it'll show us the events though. That's what I really want to see. But I don't know if it'll show us this here. Interesting. Well, the thing is that every HTML element has corresponding event handling events that you can call on them. Just like a button, right? We talked about with the button, every button has kind of that on-click event handling capability, right? Similarly, every form has a series of events also that we can call when a user's interacting with a form. So here's some of them, right? So a couple of them that are really important to know, name, right? On submit, right? When a form is submitted, this function gets called. This event handling thing gets called on submit, right? On change is another one that's really important to note, where whenever an element inside of a form is getting changed, it calls this on change event. So whenever, whether it's a select, whether it's an input, etc., on change is an event that gets triggered whenever a user starts interacting with part of our form. So all three of these inputs, we might want to keep track of when they're being changed, right? And when they're being changed, on change, right? We might want to do something like keep track of this data in the state. And that's exactly what we're going to do here, right? So every form element, like an input, whatever, select, etc., has this on change event handler. The on change event handler in React looks a little different than the one in HTML. It just has a capital C. But the on change event handling attribute allows for us to, just like we did with our button, if we go back to our button, right, where we use the on click handler and pass in a function. Well, now with the form, we could do the same thing, but with the on change function. So here, right, I could do something like say, okay, well, when this form is changed, I want to set the first name to be something different, right? Just set the first name to be a little bit different. So in the case of the button, y'all saw how what I did here with the button was we had the on-click event handling function. We had the on-click handler, the attribute here, and this attribute, we passed in a function that we created, right? So we could do the same thing where, you know, we do something like, okay, cool, like before we return, I could do something like handle first name change or something, right? And make a nice little new function. And in this function, right, whenever this gets called, I might want to set first name to some data, right? So if I wanted to do it like this, well, here I'd want to call handle first name change as a function, right? And what's important to know is that whenever an event handling function gets triggered, so whenever this is getting triggered, this function that we call gets access to a piece of data that is called an event object. And so let's just take a look at that real quick so you can see what I mean. So the way we reference the event object is we pass in the function some variable that's going to represent the event object. Sometimes you see people write event like this. Sometimes you see people write E like this. Oops. I personally like writing event out so that anyone reading my code knows what's going on, but it's just important to know that some developers just say E. But either way, with this event object, we get back a lot of really important information about the particular event that got triggered. So this event object can be passed in any event handling function. So our onClick function, right, where we call handle click right here, right? This function also, we could have passed an event object if we wanted to make use of the data in the event object. But because we didn't need it, we didn't pass it here. This is screaming at me about some stuff here in the form. Let's take a look at log on in the sign up form. First name is not defined. Oh, I don't know what this just did. That's crazy. Oh, my bad. I was supposed to put a nice little variable in front of these things. My bad. My bad, React. I'm sorry. Okay. Hopefully now stop being mad. Okay. All right, bet. So whenever now, right, whenever we just added that event to the first input, first name, right? So whenever first name gets changed, I'm gonna console log out this event. But before we take a look at that, I also just to make sure that we can see that this is gonna work, I'm gonna put an alert to say changed, right? So save this and then we go back. Let's go back to our app. Nice. Whoops, went to the wrong place. Typical Cam stuff. All right, sign up. All right, cool. So I start typing and cool, as soon as I start typing, it says, oh, changed, right? So now we're detecting when this particular input itself, right, is being changed. Anytime it's being changed, we're gonna call this function handle first name change. That function is gonna alert us. And then if we take a look at the console, I'm gonna just open up the console one more time. Right, go to the console and here's some issues just because of HTML versus React. That's basically when we use this for, where did I do that? Oh, here, I don't need this. So we'll do it one more time, make it smooth, make it smooth. All right, app, sign up, go here. Ooh, you changed me, cool. Holla at the console and you can see this synthetic based event, right? This is console logging from our app. This event is what the object I was talking about that we get back whenever an event is being processed on the DOM, right, in JavaScript. So JavaScript has now access to all this information about that particular event. One thing that's really cool is there's a particular field in the event called the target that will show you which particular HTML element triggered the event. Clearly, we can see that this was the event triggered by input with the ID fname, right? First name here. This target also has a value associated with it. And that value has the letter A, which is clearly the same thing I just typed here. So if I were to change this again, and let's just say I'm about to spell another person's name, right? Clearly that alert just fired. And in the console, again, we have another event that just got triggered. We can see that the event was the on change. And again, if we take a look at the target and the value, now we have that other updated name there, right? So this is great. This is going to help us in keeping track of like all this information in the form, right? Clearly, I don't want to make an alert happen every time a user changes it. And I might not even want to console log the whole thing, but I did it just so we could see that, hey, well, now we have the ability to set the first name. And you might be wondering, well, what will we set it to? Well, remember that event has a target with a value that is tied to literally what it is that we just typed. So typically what we'll do to save this data in the state is we're going to set that value. So set first name to event.target.value, right? So take this event object, look at the target and get the value. And this will allow us now to keep a record of, hey, whatever the user's typing in there, now we have stored in our state as first name, right? So next time we use first name anywhere, we'll have a record of whatever the user typed in that input for ourselves. So what to just kind of show, well, let's just do this real quick, save this. And again, right, like, so I have these handle kind of functions, right? So if I wanted to, I could kind of copy this logic and say, oh, let me give myself two more, right? One for handle last name change, right? But instead of setting the state for the first name, we'll set the state for the last name, right? And then same thing for the email, right? So I could just say handle email change, and then here set the email. And then clearly, if I go down to these other labels and I add the on change event handle attribute there, right? I could say handle last name change for this one. And I could say something like same thing, change, handle, email, change, right? So now each of those inputs have their own corresponding event handling function. There's some ways where I might be able to do all of this with one function, but just to kind of show you what's going on there in a way that hopefully makes a little more sense. Each of those on change will trigger their own corresponding function, such that now whenever we finish filling out the form, we should have access to all the data that we want. So the last thing I want to do is just make it so that when we submit the form, right, when we press submit to the form, I want to just make sure I could see all the data that's there, right? So one thing I can do is make use of the form. The form has a on submit event handle function that we just kind of saw in the HTML. And just like the on change and all these other things, on submit is another place where we can pass a function to handle the submit, right? So I'm just going to create a quick little function here. And this function, all I'm going to have it do is just kind of make an alert real quick, and I will pass it here so we can call it handle submit. And what this alert will do is just kind of say, you know, thanks for submitting. And I want it to show the data for the name and the last name, or maybe like, you know, just maybe the first name, last name, so we can validate that it's working. I don't maybe need to put the email in there. So this is a great place to show you one last thing, which is in JavaScript, we can create templated or formatted strings. So in JavaScript, there's three ways to create a string. One way is with the single quotes, one way is with the double quotes. The reason you use one or the other is because let's say I have some contraction in here, like there's an apostrophe right? Like if I have this single thing here, I need to wrap this in double. So that's one of the places where that comes up. But last thing is we could use a templated string, which has these backticks as a starting point. With the backticks, I can pass data into the string by using this kind of syntax, $ with the curly braces. So here I can say, thanks for submitting. And now inside of here, I can pass JavaScript, right? So what JavaScript might I want to pass? Well, I have these state variables that I might want to use. So I can say, thanks for submitting, first name, right? And then if I want to add that other one, I could just put another one and it's with a nice little space in between and just say last name, right? Put a little exclamation mark at the end. And because I know we're short on time, go back to the app. So just put Cam Flowers. I could put an email thing in here. That's fine. Oh, and one last thing I'll do real quick, just so we can actually see that this is working, is under the alert, I'll console log all of the state values. So console log first name, last name, and email. So save that one time. And cool. So now I type Cam. Whoa, my bad, y'all. Don't need y'all to see random Google Drive activity real quick. But cool, sign up, go ahead, Cam Flowers, put my email in there, and then let's go. And cool, thanks for submitting, Cam Flowers. And if I press OK, technically I'd want to see the console log. There's a good reason why the form reloaded. It's because whenever we submit in React, it tells the page to reload. And we can stop that by just passing another event handling, right? So we have this handle submit being called. One way to stop the page from reloading whenever something like this is happening is we can call a method on the event called prevent default, which basically stops the page from reloading when it gets submitted. So I'm just gonna do Cam Flowers one more time, and then cam@blah.com for y'all. Let's go. Cool. Thanks for submitting, Cam Flowers. The page stays here. So if we take a look, I guess I got rid of it. But if we take a look at the console, we'll see all of that state data saved there, right? So just send it one more time. Thanks for submitting. Cool. And here we can see in the console, first name, last name, and then our email is being registered by the form, which is great. So now I have that information. If I were to continue to build on this, I could send that information to a database or to a server, save it to actually register the user. But now, right, if the user is actually authenticated, right? Now they might be able to log in and see all their messages, right? And that's kind of our little defaulted WhatsApp little situation so far. So appreciate y'all. Sorry I went a little bit over today, but you know the vibes, we're live coding. So I did thank you, and I will follow up with y'all shortly.